Next, Dr. Bill Maas. And Dr. Maas is here from out of town, so we made the decision to give him a little extra time. So, Dr. Maas, you're up.
Thank you, Commissioners. The official address listed at my registration here is Washington, D.C., where the office is, but I actually live in Bethesda, Maryland. And you may recognize that because that's the home of the National Institutes of Health. Many of my neighbors are scientists at the National Institutes of Health. Our families live there, their families, their children, and they all drink the fluoridated water that we have in our water system. I get my health care at the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, also Bethesda, Maryland. I live in the same community as the doctors that treat me and my family there. We and our families all drink fluoridated water. So that should tell you something. No concerns are raised about the safety or effectiveness of fluoridated water by those folks. If I run out of time, there's a few points I want to make sure that I state. One is tooth decay is a burden in Wichita. Not only do we have the concerns of children in pain that are distracted and unable to learn, may miss school, and affects their school performance, but just the cost of repairs. Even if tooth decay was something that you could simply repair without any pain, I estimate just on some data that's been provided by a few of the insurance companies that Wichita is probably spending $25 million a year per year, every year, on fillings for new decay, and much of that decay could be prevented with water fluoridation. It's important to understand that community water fluoridation is effective. Approximately 25% reduction in tooth decay. It's safe. On that, I'm not going to give you any percentage because it is absolutely safe. It is cost effective. We can argue about whether the savings are $38 for $1 invested, or $10 saved for every $1 invested, or $2 saved for every $1 invested. If anybody here promises to give me $2 for every $1, I'll meet you out in the lobby afterwards because I'd like to make that arrangement. And it's equitable. Water fluoridation helps those who are at highest risks. I do want to comment on a couple of things that were mentioned here. One was that mild fluorosis, which is widespread in this country, is something that people would want to pay to repair. Mild fluorosis is associated with lower tooth decay, and when parents are asked about their children's oral health-related quality of life, parents of children with mild fluorosis report their children's oral health-related quality of life to be higher than those of children that don't have that. It's also been mentioned about the Department of Defense and the United States Air Force. Just recently, the Department of Defense reaffirmed its support of water fluoridation, directing all of its bases to fluoridate the water. And the difference between this directive and the one from several decades ago is before there was focused on the children living on bases. Now we understand fluoridated water prevents tooth decay of people of all ages, and there's concern that the members of the U.S. military, the people working and serving on those bases, will benefit from fluoridated water and reduce the burden of tooth decay. Now, how is it that I've come here? Well, early in my career, I am board certified in dental public health. Early in my career, I worked for the Indian Health Service, was responsible for the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Iowa, just north here a little ways. After I received my formal public health training, I worked in various assignments in the public health service related to health services, cost, quality, and access issues. So I kind of got away from water fluoridation. In 1997, I was promoted to Assistant Surgeon General of the U.S. Public Health Service. In 1998, I was appointed to be Director of the Division of Oral Health at CDC. And so at that point, it was my time to update my understanding about water fluoridation, because people opposed to water fluoridation were calling me and sending me information about studies that they had. And so, fresh into that position, I had to look into how fluoridation works, and I was impressed at how much more we knew than 30 years earlier when I had gone to dental school. And we've come to learn that fluoridation prevents tooth decay in both children and adults. The other thing that I was really quite impressed with is that we know more about safety. In 1993, the National Research Council, which is a part of the National Academy of Sciences, issued a comprehensive report on the health effects of fluoride in drinking water. And so it was an eloquent report, and it confirmed the safety of fluoride at the levels we recommend to improve dental health. Now, the important thing to understand about CDC is not a regulatory agency. CDC makes recommendations, and the only strength of those recommendations is the credibility of those recommendations based on the weight of the science, the weight of the evidence that supports those recommendations. You should also know that the public views CDC as the most credible of public agencies. And so that's something that CDC takes very seriously. And everything on CDC's website is carefully reviewed and scrutinized. If the public has a challenge to that, there's a process for them challenging that. Now, 1998 also coincides with the beginning of the Internet. You know, you remember Mark Twain said a lie can spread around the world in the time it takes the truth to put on its boots. Well, that was before the Internet. So imagine when information can go around the world at the speed of light. And the opponents to water fluoridation were very quick to use the Internet, and they've used the Internet very effectively to put information that really appeals right to the public. It's misinformation, but people feel well informed because it's so easy to get that information. So my role at CDC was to say, well, how do we get our evidence-based information out to the public? So we began to use the Internet as well, providing as much information as we could on our website as comprehensively as possible. I'm sorry to say that in the way we organize our information, it's there to guide public health workers, health professionals, and policymakers. It's organized in a very systematic way, and it is not organized in a way that allows people to kind of dispel myths or to check on things that they might have read or seen on the Internet. So while the information is very credible, it's sometimes hard for the public to access it. And so other organizations draw from that and try to translate that, synthesize that information into information that's a little more accessible to the public. You know, in my time at CDC, I accepted that the decisions about water fluoridation were made at the state and local level. It's not a federal policy. As a federal agency, we could conduct research and make recommendations, but the decision was made at the state and local level, and I accepted that completely. What concerned me is when I would hear people talk about why they were against water fluoridation, they gave reasons that were not supported by the evidence, and that was very disturbing to me then. I'm putting out this information on our website, and somehow or another we're just not reaching the people. So that's why I'm glad that now that I'm not working at CDC anymore, I'm working for the Pew Charitable Trust. Pew Charitable Trust is in partnership with a few dozen organizations to form the Campaign for Dental Health, supporting a dissemination of information that is a little more accessible to the public and more directly answers the questions that the public has. We have a website called ILikeMyTeeth.org, and I encourage people to use that as a kind of accessible information, even though you would still want to go to the CDC to get the definitive information. And so in that role, we're working with these national organizations and with local organizations, medical organizations, dental organizations, and foundations to try to provide information as I'm providing here today with you. And I'll be here the rest of the day to meet with others to try to answer their questions about fluoridation. But we did have an open meeting yesterday, and so it was my first taste of what people are hearing in Wichita, and I've heard some of it already today. And I'm afraid to tell you that much of what you heard and much of the information people have is misinformation that's not supported by the evidence. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Maas. We do have a light, so if you don't hang close.
Dr. Maas, I have a few questions for you. Are you familiar with the York study?
Yes.
From my understanding, it's from York University and published in the British Medical Journal?
Yes. Yes, and you can find the details of that on the CDC website. We provide a link right to that report. We also provide a concise summary of that report.
So you find that report credible?
I find that report credible. And that report was published in 2000. In 2001, we did a similar study in the United States just focused on effectiveness. The York study focused on both effectiveness and safety. In the United States, we already had the 1993 National Research Council report to address safety. On the issue of effectiveness, the United States review of the same studies and some others was conducted by the U.S. Task Force on Community Preventive Services. And that's an independent group of experts, medical and public health experts. And the difference between that group and the York group is the York group used the tradition used in England of reviewing medical research. And the highest standard was for controlled clinical trials, randomized controlled clinical trials. And so when they say that evidence isn't very strong, it's because it doesn't meet the standards of a randomized controlled clinical trial. The U.S. Task Force on Community Preventive Services recognizes that community trials can't be done that way. You can't randomize people to receive one intervention or another. So while the standard is different, it's still high standards. There was only 21 studies found to be credible by that standard. But it doesn't expect people, for example, to be randomized. People can't be blinded to whether they have fluoride in their water or not, and things like that that would make a study not meet the York criteria. The U.S. Preventive Services Task Force reviewed the 21 studies. Half of them were published since 1992, so they represent modern day. And the median reduction in tooth decay was 29. The median reduction was 29%, meaning that half of the studies showed greater than 29%, half showed less than 29%.
And what about the position of the National Kidney Foundation? Are you aware
Yes, I've actually talked to the Chief Medical Officer of the National Kidney Foundation. If you want to know what the Kidney Foundation thinks about the role of fluoride, go to their website. Go to where they give advice to people about their nutrition and their diet. You'll see they make recommendations about several minerals that can be hazardous or cause a problem for people with chronic kidney disease. You will note they say nothing about fluoride because that is not a concern. Several decades ago, the National Kidney Foundation had a statement that it had endorsed water fluoridation. More recently, they realized, well, that's not really our job to endorse water fluoridation. Our job is to give advice to people with chronic kidney disease on how to remain healthy. And so when someone says they've dropped their endorsement, they realize it wasn't their business to endorse water fluoridation. It was their business to guide people with chronic kidney disease as to how to have the best health outcome they can. They have no concerns about the health effects of optimally fluoridated water on people with chronic kidney disease.
Well, from what I'm reading, they changed the position because it was challenged, that there's no scientific evidence.
Well, the position was challenged, and they said, really, we shouldn't have a position endorsing water fluoridation. We should have a position focused solely on what's best for people with chronic kidney disease. And they also call for more research, as did the National Research Council in 2006. I would expect a National Research Council to call for more research. We can always do more research. We can always learn more. But on the basis of the information we have now, there's no reason for people with chronic kidney disease. Chronic kidney disease is a really serious disease, okay? But there's no reason for those people to worry about optimally fluoridated water.
They do, however, recommend that people with chronic kidney disease be notified of the potential risk of fluoride.
Yes, because
they've also recommended monitoring intake of potentially susceptible CKD population.
Realize that in the United States, if you're on a public water supply, you can have fluoride levels up to 4 parts per million, or 4 milligrams per liter. That's the regulated dose. Or the EPA is a regulatory agency, and they do not allow public water supplies to have more than 4. So if you were a person with chronic kidney disease and you were one of the 1.5 million people who live in communities with 2 to 4 parts per million, you might want to pay attention to that and be aware of that. So that recommendation is you've read the recommendation, but it's so people can distinguish between whether they live in a place with optimally fluoridated water, which is 0.7 parts per million, or whether they happen to be in one of those communities that has higher levels.
Well, I think it goes beyond that. They acknowledge that fluoride comes into our bodies from a variety of ways, and they recommend that you should take a look at the total intake from a variety of areas, not just the water. Now, one other question. I've been given some information here that says from the CDC that since, for example, in 1986 to 87, that fluorosis in the ages 2 to 12% was 22%, and now in 1999 to 2004, the incidence of fluorosis has increased to 40.7.
One of the things that's happened in that time, you realize that whatever we see in those national surveys, we're actually seeing the results of what happened when those children were from 0 to 6, basically, or 0 to 8 years old, because that's when the teeth are forming under the gums, when fluoride can affect them, causing the fluorosis, the mild fluorosis, or more severe levels. So when the 1986-87 survey, the children surveyed there were actually in their tooth-forming years in the 50s and 60s. The more recent survey had children in their tooth-forming years in the 80s. During that time, there was a tremendous increase in the use of fluoridated toothpaste. I'm of the generation where I was already a school kid before Crest came out, the first fluoridated toothpaste, and so it was a big deal to start using fluoridated toothpaste. Not all toothpaste had that. Eventually, by the 80s, virtually every toothpaste had fluoride in it. So you had a great increase between those two surveys, you had a great increase in the use of fluoride toothpaste. It was not until the early 90s that there was any warning put on toothpaste tubes for people to supervise their children's use of it, to use a pea-sized amount, to limit its use in children less than 2, and basically to supervise it. my kids all were at the tooth forming years in the 80s before that announcement. My job was to make sure there was a big tube of toothpaste in the bathroom, and I wanted to make sure they used it. And if I saw toothpaste smeared all over the doorknob and the mirror, I figured my kids were using it. I really did not have any concern that they'd be getting too much. But we now realize children can swallow it. They made stuff in bubblegum flavor and grape flavor and things like that. So kids, think that they should eat this stuff. And so I think much of the fluorosis that we saw in the recent survey is a reflection of those children eating toothpaste before there was any warning recommending parents to supervise
not a
that.
result of fluoridation of water.
If you can trend both of those, fluoridated water didn't increase as much as toothpaste use. But I will, you do have to understand that it's the total amount of fluoride that's going to matter, that's going to affect that. And there's a lot of variation in the population. But the tolerable intake, most of the variation is a level much below the level of concern. But if you add things up, if you have fluoridated water and for example, your physician prescribes fluoride supplements for those children, not realizing it's fluoridated water, or if the children swallow fluoridated toothpaste, they will exceed the level that we'd recommend. So it just requires caution, basically.
Right. Well, I guess that's one of the issues is how do people control the total overall dosage that they receive. But if we add fluoride to our water, would you expect the incidence of fluorosis to increase in our community?
Yes. Yes, I would expect you would have more children with white flecks on their teeth. I would expect that when you looked at those children, you would think that their teeth were very attractive. I would think you would find your children would have less tooth decay. I don't think people will complain about having more children have very mild fluorosis. I have 3 children. If I showed you pictures, you'd say, those kids have great smiles. If you ask me, do my children have fluorosis, given the carelessness with which I let them use fluoride toothpaste, I would have to say, I don't know if they have fluorosis, because only a person that's expert in diagnosing that can detect the very mild forms. It was that kind of expertise that was used in the national survey. I want you to know that your government, your National Center for Health Statistics, does want to understand this. So when we do our national surveys, we really try. We even have a category called questionable, where we're just not sure. So they look at those, they dry those teeth off and look at them as carefully as they can to see what evidence they can have of some of this change in the mineralization that leads to the opacities. We're trying to understand that because we don't want it to be too high. There's no reason for it to be higher than it needs to be. But we accept a certain trade-off between very mild fluorosis and the protection against tooth decay that provides.
See, that is the crux of the situation in many respects. You accept that trade-off.
Oh, absolutely. That trade-off has been accepted since the very beginning. They were aware of this when they first began to fluoridate the water.
But how do we balance that with the individual right to decide whether they want to accept that trade-off? I mean, medicine, at least as I've always practiced, was an individual art. I mean, you treated people as individuals, and these are the pros and the cons of the treatment. You decide if you want to accept those risks. But now what we're being asked to do is to make that, as a government body, to make that decision for them.
Right. Well, you have to understand that fluorosis occurs even in communities that don't have fluoridated water.
Sure.
It occurs at a lower level. So, I don't know, we're not going to eliminate it completely. If a person was really concerned about this for their children, and they were willing to trade off, and have their child have less protection against tooth decay because they didn't want mild dental fluorosis, they could use an alternative source of water for that child. They could not let their child brush with fluoridated toothpaste. I mean, that would be a way for them to reduce that level as much as they could, given that it's not completely controllable. Frankly, I don't know why an individual would do that, but it would be pretty easy for them to do that. I think that would be very few individuals once they understood the facts, but they would be able to do that. And the question is, do you have the rest of the community suffer with higher disease than they need to because you're concerned about this burden on a few people that kind of have extreme view of the issue?
Well, I don't believe individual decision-making in medical treatments is an extreme viewpoint, but you can make the argument that the people in the community who want more fluoride could go out and get more fluoride. There are alternatives, and they could take that action.
All of those alternatives are less effective, more expensive, and less likely to reach the people that need them most. But that's an alternative. And when we think about options for communities, it's important to consider those things. I really very much doubt that this community is prepared to make the kind of investment in alternatives to help improve the dental health as the same outcome that would be accrued to water fluoridation. In Juneau, Alaska, the capital of Alaska, when they discontinued fluoridation, there was a promise made that they thought they could overcome that by providing fluoride to the children in school. They never did that. And that doesn't even begin to address the issue of adults. You know, the typical 55-year-old person has 55 surfaces with tooth decay in this country. We get new surfaces of tooth decay at the rate of about 1 per year. This isn't just a problem of childhood. This is a problem that affects the whole population. While when we first fluoridated the water, we thought it only was effective when we provided it to children during the tooth forming years. Now we realize it protects tooth decay of people of all ages. So that's really the trade-off you're making when you accept a suboptimal level of fluoride rather than the optimal level of fluoride in the drinking water.
All right, one last question. Does the daily recommended intake of fluoride stay the same throughout life, or does it change with age, medical condition, things like that?
There's an adequate intake and there's a tolerable upper limit as far as what the Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Science proposes. I think now, it's our understanding is that adequate intake, it can be much more variable than we first knew. That it doesn't matter so much what that intake is, given that fluoride continues to be effective throughout the lifespan. The important thing is that tolerable upper limit. And the tolerable upper limit is defined as a level that you shouldn't exceed often. I mean, you could get over it from time to time, from day to day, but you wouldn't want to consistently receive a level of fluoride that was higher than that amount. That amount is different for different ages. For adults, that level is 10 milligrams per day. It's a level far above what anybody could get, even with almost the most extreme dietary habits in a community with optimally fluoridated water. The level is much lower for children. It gets to this point of for children when their teeth are forming, it is important to make sure that those children don't get too much fluoride, which is why we would recommend using optimally fluoridated water, being very careful with the toothpaste, and if a child was exclusively being fed formula that's reconstituted with water, if that was the exclusive part of their diet and they weren't getting other foods, that the parents could use an alternative source of water for that short period of time when they'd be in that window of time. But it's still, only a few children would even exceed that tolerable intake. But again, you wouldn't want to do it day in and day out. For example, using that alternative source. I've had 3 kids. I got 2 grandchildren. They haven't exclusively used, and by the time they were ready to use the formula, they were already having other foods in their diet. So that's been no concern for us at all. Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Commissioners, don't run out. Did you have a question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Commissioner Skelton.
Sir, I wanted to ask you about a statement you made about fluorosis and the possible effects of white spots on children's teeth.
Yes.
And you also made it effect that you'd find that beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. If I found on my daughter's teeth a substance that is abnormal caused by chemicals introduced in our water supply, I'd be irritated. I would be beyond irritated. I would wonder what internal effects would be going on. What kind of white spots is she going to have on her bones, etc. That's a symptom of something larger, sir. You cannot conclusively say that would be the only physiological effect is white spots on teeth. Okay? Now, I'm going to finish here, please, okay? We've got enough chemicals in our food supply already. I mean, the 4 food groups has changed to the food pyramid. And we're looking at all this government research. We know that cancer rates are high in this country, heart disease is high in this country, Alzheimer's is high, obesity up. And when we talk about our government recommendations, we follow these recommendations, and this is what we get. So I just don't like any chemicals in my food supply. And if anybody wants to know why I'm such an avid deer hunter, they don't get growth hormones or antibiotics or put on a corn-fed diet. They're natural, etc. I could go into that, but the force an antibacterial agent like a toxic agent like fluoride that could cause symptoms such as I described earlier, and you said that would be beautiful on your daughter, I think I just take exception to that, and I apologize if I appear irritated, because I really think a lot of this has to do with genetics and your own personal hygiene habits. Those are my comments, Mr. Chairman.
I would like to comment on the concern that if this is what's happening to the teeth, then there must be something else going on. People have been saying that, at the very least for 30 years, which is when the EPA first began to regulate fluoride levels in drinking water. And during the tooth-forming years, the fluoride is being concentrated with the calcium at that where the tooth is being formed, where the crystal structure is being laid down. And so I don't find it surprising that with high levels of fluoride there'd be some disturbance to that. And what that disturbance is it lays down the crystal structure is laid down a little bit differently. And so the translucency, the way light refracts through it, is different. All we're seeing on that tooth with these mild levels is that the crystal's got a little bit different look, and so the light's refracting different and looking white.
Yes, sir.
Now, somebody says, so what's happening in the rest of the body? Well, that's why, again, people have had your concern. And so we've been continuing to study whether there's any health effects, any other health effects from fluoride, and none have been detected. And I think that's understandable because fluoride is common. It's common, one of the most common elements in the world. So it is just a part of the body deals with that. It concentrates in the bone. The only half of it is excreted and half of it concentrates in the bone. The only time that it appears to have a change that just isn't part of the normal metabolism is that tooth-forming years, which changes this crystalline structure. People are looking to try to understand the concern that you have, but no evidence has been found of that.
Yes, sir. You're using light spectroscopy to identify the chemicals in that substance. That's what you're doing. You're going to break down the light, and you're going to analyze the colors of the light, because each element that is on a periodic table will provide a certain light. Is that correct?
Well,
okay, so we've got unknown substances in there, ones that were not put there by our bodies. Science is an ongoing art, and it changes a lot.
And we make our recommendations based on the best science.
Yeah, we do our best, but you know what? Science changes all the time and by quite a bit. And if you're telling me by using spectroscopy you're able to identify chemicals that are not natural to the body, I think you've made my point for me, sir. I'm done.